Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, in our previous lecture, we developed some ideas, some concepts about the balance of payments. We consolidated our understanding of how the market for foreign exchange operated. We distinguished between the cases when there was a fixed exchange rate regime and a floating exchange rate regime. We looked at balance of payments accounts, and we looked at the three components thereof: the current account, the capital account, and the changes to reserves account. And we saw how, if the exchange rate was fixed, this had implications for the third account, whereas if the exchange rate was a floating one, then equilibrium would automatically obtain through the price mechanism. Now, if you had been listening to my last lecture carefully, you might remember that we ended on the discussion as to what current account and capital account, those two accounts meant. What was the distinction between them? And I said that the current account basically talks about transactions or captures transactions which do not have an implication for the net asset position of the country, whereas a capital account has implications for the net asset position of a country. Although, because the current account and the capital account were linked in the sense that you had to have compensating balances, compensating signs on the two. That is, if you had a large current account deficit, then you could only sustain that by having a large capital account surplus, an equally large capital account surplus. Otherwise, you would have balance of payments disequilibrium also in the accounting sense. But if you had been listening to my lecture carefully, then you might have thought about why do we need to have a surplus on the capital account in order to finance a current account deficit. Why can't we simply draw down our foreign exchange reserves? Why can't the government supply the additional dollars to the market in order to make up for the additional demand for dollars that exists there? That's a very good question if it came into your mind. Now, the answer to that simply is that yes, if the government has enough resources, enough foreign exchange reserves to finance the current account deficit, then it might well pump that excess supply into the market to sweep the excess demand. But usually the government does not have enough foreign exchange reserves, at least when we are talking in the context of lower income countries or developing countries like Pakistan. Then, as you might have heard earlier, that we used to have foreign exchange reserves only worth, let's say, 2 months of imports. So how could you finance, let's say, a yearly sort of magnitude of current account deficit, which would be 12 months of imports, by constantly pumping dollars into the market? You would not have that kind of foreign exchange reserve cushion. So yes, theoretically it is entirely possible for the government to provide the foreign exchange supply to the market if an excess demand exists. But practically, it is often constrained by the reserves that any individual government has, and this is usually not large enough to finance current account deficits year after year after year. Either you have to go to international capital markets to borrow, either in the form of debt, or to encourage or ask foreign investors to come in and provide a surplus on the capital account which can balance the deficit on the current account. Or you simply have to treat the causes of the current account deficit and try to reverse the position there. This naturally leads us to the question of how we can address or treat current account disequilibrium or capital account disequilibrium. If you have a problem on the current account or on the capital account, that is, you're not able to get enough resources from outside, enough capital from outside, or you're not able to generate a good current account surplus or a good current account balance, then how can we address that problem? So we need to go into the determinants of the current account and the capital account of the balance of payments. Now there technically could be a number of determinants of the current account and the capital account, that they are often different. but we will be focusing on one determinant in each case. That is, we will be focusing on the real exchange rate as the determinant of the current account, and interest parity, the interest parity condition, as a determinant of the capital account balance. Let's first talk about the current account. Now, we discussed earlier that as the income level of an economy increases, the demand for imports increases. That is, as consumers' incomes rise, some of that increase in income is likely to fall on foreign goods. That is, consumers would like to increase their expenditure on foreign goods as well. And that causes the value of imports to increase. However, because often increases in income are also associated with price increases, at the same time your own exports are becoming more expensive. That is, the goods produced in the economy are becoming more expensive, and this often causes exports to reduce. So imports are rising, exports are falling. And as you know, imports and exports of goods and services are the key items in the current account. And this can often lead to a deterioration of the current account balance. So the first determinant of the current account balance is income. That is, if income increases, the current account balance is likely to deteriorate. This does not mean that rising incomes are a bad thing. No, but at the margin, this is the relationship is likely to hold. That is, higher incomes are likely to manifest in worsening current account deficits. However, there is also the other determinant, another very important determinant of the current account balance. The current account balance is basically, if we narrow it down to exports and imports, the difference between exports and imports. That is, how much the country can sell abroad minus how much the country imports from outside. Now, what determines the attractiveness of foreign goods to domestic goods will also determine what the quantity of exports and imports will be. So if the local economy is producing very high quality goods at a very good price, then those goods will sell very well on the international market. Everybody outside Pakistan would like to buy those goods, and therefore your exports will likely be higher. However, if the quality of the goods is not good, and if the price that they are selling at is quite high, then these factors will cause the demand for locally produced goods to fall. That is, we will not be able to export very much. So if we are not able to export very much, the mirror side of that is that we would be importing those same goods that we are producing locally, because those goods are not only unattractive to foreign buyers, but those goods are also unattractive to local buyers. So if Pakistan produces a car or a radio which is not of the same quality as, let's say, what Japan or Korea is producing, or at least not the same price quality combination that Korea or Japan is producing, then local consumers are likely to shift to importing these cars or these radios from Japan and Korea. So price is a key variable in determining the current account balance. Now let's assume for the time being that there is no difference in the quality of goods being produced by Pakistan and the rest of the world. Let's go back to our example of the two economy world, that is Pakistan and the US. Let's assume that both countries produce the same good, right? And Pakistan produces it locally at its own costs, and the US produces it in the US at a certain cost. And let's assume that there is no difference in quality. The only difference is a difference in price. Now you can well imagine that if the price of producing the good in Pakistan is higher than the price at which it is produced in the US, then naturally the local population will switch to US goods. Similarly, US consumers will switch from Pakistani goods to consuming US goods because the price of those goods is lower. So naturally the key determinant in this case is not just the individual price of the good being produced in Pakistan on the individual price in the US, it's the ratio of those two prices. So it would be the price of foreign goods divided by the price of domestic goods. If the price of foreign goods is higher relative to the price of domestic goods, then the demand for local domestic goods will increase. However, if the price of domestic goods is higher relative to the price of the US goods, then the demand for US goods would increase. This is on the price side. But price is only one determinant of the actual price that consumers in both countries have to pay to obtain goods from the other country. What's the other determinant of the actual price that consumers in these two countries have to pay in order to buy goods from the other country? Well, the answer is obvious. It's the exchange rate. That is the rate at which a dollar in the US is exchanged for rupees in Pakistan. Or if you look at it from the other way around, it's the rate at which Pakistanis obtain dollars by putting in their rupees. And that is an important determinant of the actual price burden of buying or consuming any good from the other country. So naturally, if, for example, the current rupee-dollar parity is 58 rupees to the dollar, and suddenly tomorrow the rupee devalues to or depreciates to 65 rupees to the dollar, what will be the impact, do you think, on the competitiveness or attractiveness of Pakistani goods to US consumers? Well, naturally, any dollar that they now spend in Pakistan will be able to buy more goods. Earlier, their $1 could buy 58 rupees worth of goods in Pakistan. But now their $1 can buy 65 rupees worth of goods in Pakistan. Therefore, the attractiveness of Pakistani goods to US consumers has increased. So, my friends, now we have two determinants of the attractiveness of Pakistani exports to US consumers, or the attractiveness of Pakistani goods to US consumers. What are the two determinants? The first one was the relative price ratio, PF divided by PD, where D stands for domestic and F stands for foreign, where F foreign is the US and D domestic is Pakistan. So one is the relative price ratio, the price of producing that good in the US versus the price of producing that good in Pakistan. The other determinant is the exchange rate, in this case denominated in rupee versus dollars. That is, how many rupees does $1 exchange into. And if that parity changes, then that also affects the attractiveness of Pakistani goods. Now, the word that we've used, attractiveness, is often replaced by a more technical term, and that is called competitive. Are Pakistani goods competitive internationally? That is, do they compete well with other possible options that US consumers have in front of them? You remember, US consumers can buy goods not only from Pakistan, they can buy goods from China, Japan, India, all other countries. So are Pakistani goods competitive vis-a-vis these other potential exporters to the US? So the term competitive often replaces the term attractive. So let's develop a variable which can combine these two measures or factors that affect the competitiveness of Pakistani goods. In other words, let's try to develop a variable which combines these two factors. That is relative prices, PF over PD, and the exchange rate as number of rupees per US dollar. The measure that we can come up with, or that economists have come up with, is that of the real exchange rate. So it's the nominal exchange rate. Nominal exchange rate is simply the exchange rate that is quoted in the newspapers. That is 58 rupees to the dollar. That is, if you go into the market and exchange the dollar for rupees, that's the exchange rate that you get. That's the nominal exchange rate. And you adjust it for relative prices in order to get the real exchange rate. The term real again comes from the fact that we have adjusted the nominal exchange rate by relative prices, the relative prices prevailing in abroad versus the price prevailing in Pakistan. And because whenever we adjust nominal variables for prices, we get real variables, the same principle holds here as well. We have a nominal variable, the nominal exchange rate, and we have converted it into a real variable by adjusting for relative prices. Let's look at a slide to see what the simple formula of the real exchange rate is and what implications does it have for how the nominal exchange rate must respond to changes in the relative price ratio. Let's go to our slide. As you can see here, my friends, the formula for the real exchange rate is simply equal to PF over PD multiplied by the nominal exchange rate, that is denominated rupees per dollar. Now, what is the implication of this measure? The implication is of this formula that the real exchange rate is just another measure for the competitiveness of Pakistani goods relative to US goods. Why is it a measure of competitiveness? It is quite simple to see. Look at what happens when the price of foreign goods increases in this formula. That is, PF goes up. What happens to competitiveness? When PF goes up, that is, it's expensive to produce the goods in the US, the Pakistani goods become cheaper. For any given exchange rate, therefore, our competitiveness improves. Now, what happens if PF over PD is constant, but the nominal exchange rate depreciates? That is, there are more rupees that are exchanged for any single dollar. That is, if the exchange rate depreciates from 58, let's say, to 65, that will have the impact that US consumers will be able to buy more of Pakistani goods. That is, Pakistani goods will become cheaper for US consumers. So both of these effects, that is either an increase in the relative price ratio or a depreciation or devaluation in the exchange rate, that is both upward movements, will cause an increase in the left hand side, that is competitiveness. That is, any increase in the real exchange rate is tantamount to an increase in the competitiveness of Pakistani goods relative to US goods. A very important implication of this formula is how the nominal exchange rate must respond in order to adjust for changes in relative prices. So think about what happens when the price of domestic goods increases. That is, the first term in the right hand side, that is PF over PD, falls. If PF over PD falls, this means that our competitiveness will go down. That is, our real exchange rate will go down. Real exchange rate going down means that the real exchange rate is appreciating. That is, our goods are becoming less competitive. Now, if our goods become less competitive, this means that our current account deficit will worsen, or our current account surplus will not be as large as it was before. Why is that? This is simply because as our goods become less competitive, we will be able to export less. X falls and M increases, and therefore the current account deficit deteriorates. Now, in order to rectify this situation, the nominal exchange rate must adjust. How must the nominal exchange rate adjust? The nominal exchange rate must adjust in the opposite direction as the change in PF over PD. In this case, PF over PD has fallen, therefore the nominal exchange rate must rise. That is, there should now be more rupees available per dollar. That is, if the exchange rate was 58, now it must rise to 65 or some other level. Only if the two factors offset each other will the competitiveness of Pakistani goods remain unaffected. So in order to ensure that Pakistan's current account balance remains stable at where it is very important that the nominal exchange rate adjusts to changes in the relative price ratio, and that it adjusts in the opposite direction. If PD increases, then the nominal exchange rate should depreciate or devalue. If PF increases, then the nominal exchange rate should appreciate, or it should be revalued. So, my friends, just rounding up on that, we identified two determinants of the current account. Only one is shown here. The other one was income. Yes, the higher the level of national income, the higher will imports be, and it's also likely that exports will suffer because of rising prices. And the net result of that will be a deteriorated current account position. The other determinant that we introduced, and probably the more important one, is the real exchange rate, or a measure of the competitiveness of Pakistani goods relative to US goods, or if there are more countries than relative to those other countries. And a measure of the real exchange rate basically captured the combination of the relative price ratio and the nominal exchange rate. And the key implication there was that if the price of foreign goods increased, then that would increase the competitiveness of our goods. Our goods would become cheaper. Similarly, if the nominal exchange rate depreciated, or if there were more rupees available for every dollar, then that would also make our goods cheaper and therefore help our exports, and therefore our current account balance would improve. That is, our exports would then be higher than our imports. The other important point there was to that discussion was that if there is a change in the relative price ratio, then the nominal exchange rate must adjust in the opposite direction in order to make sure that our competitiveness remains unaffected. That is, if the PD ratio increases in this case, then the nominal exchange rate must appreciate. That is, there should be less rupees available to the dollar. However, if the PF-PD ratio falls because let's say an increase in PD, then the nominal exchange rate must be devalued or must depreciate to offset that. Keep that firmly in your head. That's quite important. The discussion about the real exchange rate and how it affects the current account balance. That was the current account. What about the capital account? Well, our discussion on the capital account has identified four major items that can appear there. We had foreign portfolio investment, foreign direct investment, inflows of these investments. Then we had foreign portfolio investment, foreign direct investment, outflows of these investments. Then we had debt inflows, that is when Pakistan contracts new debt from abroad, and also when we paid our debt. Similarly for aid flows. So there are basically four types of transactions that can happen on the capital account. We need to look at what factors affect these four different types of transactions. Now, what about aid flows or concessional debt that Pakistan can get from abroad? Well, naturally, the ability of Pakistan to get debt, concessional debt, let's say from the IMF or the World Bank or from bilateral donors, or to get aid, that is money that does not have to be paid back. I'm talking about grant aid in this context. Then that depends on Pakistan's attractiveness in political or strategic terms to these donors. If Pakistan is an attractive country and has some political or strategic favors to offer to these countries, then the aid that we receive from these countries will naturally be higher. So that's one determinant of this part of these types of inflows that can come in. What about capital inflows? That is, let's talk about the foreign investment inflows that can come in. Well, the foreign investment, direct investment inflows depend on the attractiveness of the local market, the attractiveness of the costs that Pakistan has, production costs. If costs in Pakistan are low, then multinational corporations might relocate their industries, their firms, their plants to Pakistan in order to produce the goods more cheaply and then export their products to the whole world and to Pakistan from within Pakistan. So the cost structure in Pakistan, the location, whether Pakistan is close to the markets that these foreign investors want to sell to. So if Pakistan is strategically located, let's say very close to the Central Asian market or the Chinese market, and if a foreign investor wants to sell to these markets, then Pakistan's strategic location would come into play as a determinant, a positive determinant of the foreign investment that flows into Pakistan. So the attractiveness of Pakistan as a business point, as a production point, that's one determinant. The other is the environment that Pakistan offers, the political, economic, legal environment. Is it a stable political environment, or are policies changing every now and every other day? If there is political instability, for example, in the country, if the law and order is not good, if the legal infrastructure, if there is no predictability to the legal infrastructure, if the property rights are not well defined, then all of these factors can affect the attractiveness of Pakistan for foreign investors. So those were the simple factors, simple determinants of the foreign investment and the debt and aid parts of the types of capital inflows that can come in. However, I want to now focus on the foreign portfolio investment part of the capital inflows. And the determinant that's up there, that is interest parity, basically relates to the foreign portfolio inflows or foreign portfolio outflows part of the capital account. What are portfolio inflows and outflows? I mentioned earlier that portfolio investments were investments in stocks, bonds, equities, shares. So if Pakistanis invest in US bonds and stocks, that would be categorized as foreign portfolio investment outflows. Whereas if US investors came and invested in the Karachi Stock Exchange, bought Hubco shares or PTCL shares or local company shares, then that would be characterized as or categorized as, yes, inward foreign portfolio investment. And foreign portfolio investment is sensitive to returns that are available in that market. So why would US investors want to invest in the Karachi Stock Exchange? Well, the Karachi Stock Exchange is doing quite well these days, so the US investors might be attracted by that scenario, and they might want to come in and make some profits, make some money on their investments. So it's the return on investment that they can get, which is a determinant of the amount of foreign portfolio investment that can come in. Similarly, when Pakistanis decide to invest their savings, they often look at what the rate of return would be on offer on other countries. It's not just in Pakistan. So Pakistanis might decide to invest in US bonds or stocks. There might be legal restrictions to that, but at a theoretical level, it is possible for Pakistanis to think about why they want to invest their money in Pakistan at 10% or 15% versus investing it in, let's say, Lesotho or Papua New Guinea or Lithuania or Tanzania. These are all names of countries. So Pakistanis could technically think about investing in these other countries if the returns on investment are higher in these countries. So the key issue there is the rate of return on investment. Let's develop it a little bit further. So let's simplify the problem and try to understand how investors make this decision about where to invest their money. So think about a simple Pakistani family which has the option of either investing its savings in Pakistan or sending them abroad. That is, we abstract away from legal restrictions that might be on repatriating the money outside the country. Let's say those restrictions are not there. Pakistanis are free to invest locally or invest, let's say, in the US. Now, if the rates of return in Pakistan and the US are, let's say, exactly equal. Let's say if you invest your money in a bank in Pakistan, you put your money, you deposit your money there, you get a 10% interest rate or profit rate. Whereas if you invest in US bonds and stocks or US treasuries, you also get a 10% interest rate. So where would you invest? Well, you would be indifferent between the two options because the interest rate that you are getting is the same, whether you invest it in rupees locally or whether you convert it in dollars and then earn the interest in dollars there at 10% and then convert it back into rupees. However, note that this indifference only holds when the rupee-dollar exchange rate is assumed to be stable. So let's say if the rupee-dollar exchange rate was rupees 58 to the dollar or rupees 60 to the dollar for simplicity, then you are assuming that when you get your money back from the US into Pakistan after investing there for 1 year, you would still be converting the dollars back into rupees at the same exchange rate of rupees 60 to the dollar. However, if the exchange rate is unstable, then this simple interest rate equality will not ensure the indifference between these two investment opportunities. Let's try to develop this idea a little bit further through some illustrations. Let's go to a slide for this. Now, when we introduce changes or possible changes in the exchange rate, that is changes in the US dollar rupee parity, then we can talk about different interest rates that can be on offer in the US and in Pakistan. That is, the interest rates that are paid in Pakistan need not be the same as the interest rates that are being paid in the US. So let's take an example in which a household has rupees 60 to invest. It has to decide whether to invest this money in Pakistan or whether to invest this money in the US. And the investment horizon is 1 year. When he goes to a local bank in Pakistan, the bank says that it will give the person or the household 10% interest rate at the end of the year. So if it invests rupees 60 at the start of the year, it will get rupees 66 at the end of the year. The other option before the household is to invest the money in the US. But note that when you invest the money in the US, you first need to convert the rupees into dollars, because you will have to invest the money in US dollars in the US. So you convert the rupees at the current going exchange rate. Let's say the exchange rate is rupees 60 to the dollar. So you will convert your rupees 60 into dollars. How many dollars will you get? You will get $1. So you take this $1 to the US and invest it at the interest rate that is being offered by US banks or US bonds. What could this interest rate be? Let's say this interest rate is 3%, much lower than the 10% that is on offer in Pakistan. So how much dollars would you have at the end of the year? You would have 1 plus $0.03. That is $1.03 at the end of the year. Now, which option was better? Was it better to invest the money locally in Pakistan and earn rupees 66 at the end of the year? Or was it better to invest in the US and earn $1.03 at the end of the year? Well, the answer to that question depends on what's happened to the exchange rate. If the exchange rate remained stable, then the $1.03 that you get at the end of the year by investing your money in the US would transfer into how many rupees? They would be equivalent to rupees 61.8. That is simply $1.03 multiplied by 60. So naturally, you will be better off by investing your money in Pakistan because you will get more rupees at the end of the year. How many rupees will you get in Pakistan? You will get rupees 66. And how many rupees equivalent would you get from the US dollar investment? Only rupees 61.8. But now let's imagine that at the end of the year or by the end of the year, the rupee-dollar parity has also changed. That is, the Pakistani rupee has depreciated against the US dollar. And when the year started, the exchange rate was rupees 60 to the dollar. Now the exchange rate at the end of the year is rupees 66 to the US dollar. Now which option is better? Well, again, you can do a similar calculation. The number of rupees or the amount of rupees that you will have by investing the money in Pakistan will be how much? Yes, it will be rupees 66. How much money will you get, however, by bringing the investment that you made in the US back into Pakistan? Well, the amount of money that you have in US dollars at the end of the year would be $1.03. But this would now be converted at an exchange rate of rupees 66 per dollar because now the exchange rate has changed by the end of the year. So how many rupees will you get? You will get rupees 67.8. which is higher than the rupees 66 that you earn in Pakistan. Now, think about it. What should the interest rate be on investing in Pakistan in order to make the investor indifferent between investing here or investing in the US? When you have this exchange rate depreciation happening, that is the rupee-dollar parity going from rupees 60 to the dollar to rupees 66 to the dollar. Well, a crude answer and a fairly good approximation is that the amount of return or the return that should be offered on the local accounts should be equal to the 3% return that the US dollar banks are offering, that the US banks are offering, plus the 10% depreciation that is happening of the rupee relative to the dollar. Therefore, if the interest rate locally is about 13%, then that should be sufficient to make the investor indifferent or make the household indifferent between investing in Pakistan or investing in the US. And clearly, if you do the calculation, then you will find that while you earned 67.98 rupees when you invested in the US, that is at 3%, and when the exchange rate depreciated from 60 to 66. But if the interest rate in Pakistan were 13% instead of 10%, then you would again get roughly the similar figures. I think around 67.8 rupees would be the earning in that case, and that's not too far off. So this can help us derive the interest parity condition, which is the condition which must hold if there is no incentive for capital to move between two countries. That is, people in Pakistan are happy with investing in Pakistan and people in the US are happy with investing in the US. Let's look at what this condition is. The condition simply is that the interest rate offered domestically should be equal to the interest rate being offered in a foreign country, that is in the US in our case, plus the expected rate of change in the exchange rate, that is the expected depreciation of the local currency relative to the foreign currency. So in this case, when you have 13% on the left hand side, you have IF equals to 3%, plus you have delta E subscript E, which in this case is 10%, and therefore the rough equality holds. This equality is referred to as the interest parity condition. Note that if this equality is not met, that is, if ID is greater than IF plus delta EE, then more people will want to invest in Pakistan, because Pakistan is offering a higher return adjusted for depreciation. Whereas if ID is less than IF plus delta EE, then money will go out from Pakistan to the US, because the local interest rate is not compensating investors enough to make up for the foreign interest rate and the depreciation in the exchange rate. So my friends, just rounding up there, the determination of how much money will come into Pakistan as foreign portfolio investment, or how much money will go out of Pakistan as foreign portfolio outflows or foreign portfolio investment going outwards, will depend on what the local interest rate is compared to the foreign interest rate adjusted for the expected depreciation of the rupee. If the two rates are equal, that is, if ID is equal to IF plus delta E subscript E, that is expected rate of depreciation, then there will be no capital inflows, that is, no foreign portfolio inflows between the two countries. However, if the two rates are different, that is, if ID is greater than IF plus delta E, or if ID is less than IF plus delta E, then that will cause inflows or outflows on the capital account through foreign portfolio inflows or outflows. So that summarizes basically our discussion of the determinants of the capital account as to whether the capital account will be in surplus or in deficit. Generally, if our interest rates are higher than IF plus delta E, then there will be a surplus, because more money will be coming into Pakistan than going out. If, on the other hand, if our interest rates are lower, then money will try to flow out. So that, my friends, concludes our discussion on the determinants of the current account and the capital account. Note these two terms, the real exchange rate and the associated concept of competitiveness, and then the concept of interest parity and the required equality between the domestic interest rate and the depreciation adjusted foreign interest rate. Very important. Now, let's zoom in for a while on the current account, because the current account is really, as I mentioned earlier, quite important in order to determine the long-term sustainability position of the balance of payments. I mentioned earlier that it is not possible for the government to keep attracting capital inflows or to keep borrowing debt from abroad. It is not possible for the government to run a very large capital account surplus in order to cover or make up for or finance a large current account deficit year after year after year. Nor does any ordinary or lower income country government have the kind of financial muscle in terms of foreign exchange reserves to pay for persistent current account deficits. Therefore, it's very important to make sure that our current account position is okay, that our current account balance is healthy, in order to ensure that our long-term balance of payments position is sustainable, that is, it is in equilibrium. Let's now zoom in on the current account. Let's start by looking at what the current account really means, what a current account deficit really means. Well, you will say it's quite a stupid question. I mean, the current account deficit is simply the difference between the receipts that you receive on the current account, that is, the difference on the goods balance, the difference on the invisible balance, that is, the services balance, and the difference in factored payments. And it's just those differences combined, and that will give you the current account balance. Let's even simplify that. Let's say that there are only the exports and imports of goods. Well, in that case, the current account deficit would be equal to the trade deficit, that is, imports minus exports. That would be equal to the current account deficit. But what does it mean? I'll put the question again, trying to invoke your curiosity in this case. Think about it. Well, note where X and M appeared earlier in our analysis of withdrawals and injections analysis. When we talked about equilibrium in a Keynesian economy, we talked about the equality of injections and withdrawals. And if you remember, we had imports appearing on the withdrawal side and exports appearing on the injection side. To be precise, we had savings, taxes, and imports as the withdrawal from the circular flow of income, and we had investment, government spending, and exports as the injections into the circular flow of income. And we said that those two terms, the sums, should be equal. That is, sigma W should be equal to sigma J. Now, can we derive a relationship from there, from that identity or that equation, in terms of m minus x or x minus m? Let's go to a slide for that. Now, we start from s plus t plus m equals I plus g plus x. Now, a little bit of rearranging will give us m minus x is equal to I minus s plus g minus t. All that you've done is you've brought x to the left-hand side, taken s and t to the right-hand side, and then you get this new relationship between these 6 variables. But this is now a very instructive and a very insightful relationship. Look at the left-hand side. What is the left-hand side? It is nothing but the current account deficit. What's the last term on the right-hand side? G minus T. That is nothing but the government budget deficit. And what's the term in the middle? Investment minus saving. That is called the private sector resource deficit. That is the amount by which private sector's investment demand exceeds the available savings to meet that investment demand. Now, it is simple to see that any increase in G minus T, that is the government budget deficit, is likely to increase the current account deficit as well, assuming that I minus S remains constant. Because note that this relationship, m minus x equals I minus S plus G minus T, is in the nature of an equation which holds at all times, that is when there is equilibrium. It's an identity in that sense. Therefore, if G minus T goes up, m minus x will also go up. That is, any increase in the government budget deficit or fiscal deficit will feed into the current account deficit. Similarly, if there is an increase in the private sector resource deficit, that is, if investment demand by firms is higher than the stock of available savings, that will also feed into a higher current account deficit. So clearly, my friends, the current account deficit can go up because of two very different reasons. It can go up because of an increased spending by government, and it can go up because of a higher private sector resource deficit. Now, what is the implication of these two different forces that can cause the current account deficit to rise on the desirability or otherwise of the current account deficit? I hope that question is not too complicated. All that I'm saying is that, let's say the current account deficit is being caused by the government running a higher deficit. That is, the government is spending more than it is receiving in taxes, right? And when the government increases its spending, part of that spending falls on imports from abroad, and that is what causes the current account deficit to worsen. Also, when the government spends more, there is more aggregate demand in the economy, and therefore consumers spend more. And yes, that spending, part of that also falls on imports. So that is how a government deficit, a government budget deficit, translates into a current account deficit. So note that if the government is running a deficit, and that's the reason for the current account deficit, it could have quite serious implications. Because once the government undertakes that expenditure and the imports come in, there is no way of reversing that in the future, right? So the government sort of completes its expenditure on imports, the consumers undertake expenditure on imports, the goods come in, the money goes out, and that's the end of that, right? The current account deficit has been incurred and has to be financed from somewhere. Compare this with when the private sector runs a resource deficit. That is, the private sector wants to invest more than what is available as savings locally. So what does the private sector do? It goes out and sort of buys goods from abroad, goods that will not be otherwise financed from the local economy. So in a way, it is raising new debt in order to finance investment. That is, there is a surplus on the capital account which is financing private sector investment, firms' investment activities. Now, if the quality of this investment is good, then the implication of this for the current account deficit is that in the longer run, that investment might generate the revenues, the growth that is needed to generate current account surpluses, to generate export production, to generate more goods and services which can then be exported to the world. So clearly, the comparison of a government deficit driving the current account deficit and a private sector resource deficit driving a current account deficit are very different. A private sector resource deficit might actually be desirable insofar as the investments that the private sector is undertaking are healthy. That is, they have a high return in the future and they can generate enough growth in the future in order to enable the country to repay the loans it has taken on the capital account to finance the current account deficit. Whereas from the government's point of view, that window is not open. The government spends and that's the end of that. There are no future revenues by virtue of the government spending more. And therefore there is no guarantee that the current account deficit that has been run and the capital account surplus or the loans that have been taken in order to finance that current account deficit will ever be paid back or could be paid back. So note that key difference on what the current account deficit is being caused by. The practical implication of this or the practical result of this analysis can be seen in the comparison of some African countries and East Asian countries. Many of these Southeast Asian countries, these tiger economies, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, ran high current account deficits in the 1980s and 1990s and earlier on as well. But these deficits, these current account deficits were mainly caused by private sector resource deficits. That is, firms wanted to invest more and therefore the debts that were being taken to finance the current account deficit were to finance firms' investment expenditure, not the government's sort of current spending, nor the private sector's households consumption. That was not being financed. This was a key difference when you compare it with what was happening in Africa. Many African and also Latin American countries ran high current account deficits, but these were not reflective of the increased investment demand in the economy. This was reflective of the higher consumption expenditure by consumers and households. And this is what caused the Latin American debt crisis to be caused in the early 1980s and the African debt problems to worsen through the 1980s and into the 1990s, when eventually a HIPC relief, a highly indebted poor countries relief package had to be negotiated for the whole of Africa. So clearly, my friends, it makes a big difference to know what is causing the current account deficit of any country, whether it is the private sector's increased investment demand, that was in the case of East Asian countries, or it is the government spending more or the households spending more. If it is the private sector investment demand, then chances are that the current account deficit will be sustainable. That is, it will not be or it will not pose long-term balance of payments problems. But if it is consumption demand or the government spending out of its hat, then it could have long-term balance of payments consequences, and the country could also be led into balance of payments crisis. So that was a discussion on the different views that what one could have on the current account deficit and how it could be looked at in different ways. Let's now move to a final discussion on how one can address current account problems. So if you have a current account deficit, what can you do about it? Irrespective of whether it is being caused by consumption or whether it is being caused by the private sector resource deficit, what can you do about devaluation? What can you do about the current account? The answer, you might have guessed, is devaluation. Can devaluation help? Now, what is devaluation? Devaluation is simply causing the exchange value of your currency to fall in terms of the foreign currency. That is, you're causing the rupee-dollar parity, let's say, to move from rupees 58 to the dollar to rupees 65 to the dollar, so that the value of the rupee is falling. Earlier, $1 bought 58 rupees, now $1 buys 65 rupees. So the value of the rupee has fallen. That's called devaluation. Devaluation is a concept which makes sense when we are talking in the realm of fixed exchange rates. Yes, keep that in your mind. So can devaluation help? Now we noted that devaluation causes a a change in the nominal exchange rate, that is, it causes the rupee-dollar parity to go up. And if you look back at the discussion on real exchange rates, this should help boost competitiveness, right? So once competitiveness goes up, then Pakistan's exports can go up, our imports will fall, and therefore the current account deficit should improve. So that's the simple argument that says that devaluation can help a country out of its current account deficit problems. But is that a given? I mean, many countries in the world have experimented with devaluation and suffered heavily. What could be the reasons for that? There are basically 4 reasons that I want to talk about. There are a number of other reasons, but 4 at this introductory level. The first one, the impact of devaluation on the current account depends critically on the elasticities of imports and exports, the elasticity of demand for imports and exports. So let's think that Pakistan's competitiveness, the exchange rate sort of is devalued. But the competitiveness of Pakistani goods does not go up because of some other reasons. Because of, let's say, quality reasons. That is, foreign consumers don't just look at the prices of Pakistani goods, they also look at the quality of Pakistani goods, and they don't like that. Or let's say that the demand for the goods that Pakistan is exporting is sort of fixed. So even if the exchange rate depreciates, the demand for our goods does not increase by a lot. That is, they are price inelastic. So that is a major factor, elasticity of demand. If the exports, Pakistani exports, and similarly imports from abroad are price elastic, then it makes sense to devalue, because then the revenue impact, the export or import value impact will be greater than the quantity impact. Pakistan might be able to sell more of its exports, but if the export elasticity is not very high, then the higher quantity will not necessarily result in higher export revenues as well. You might recall that in the case of low elasticity of demand, when the quantity goes up, the total revenue falls. So in this case, the same can happen. When the price of Pakistani goods falls because of a devaluation, the quantity of goods that is sold might increase, but the total revenues that Pakistan can get might actually fall. Also, there could be delays in the response of demand to a change in the exchange rate, and this is called the J-curve effect. That is, it is possible that in the beginning, when the exchange rate is devalued, it has a large volume effect, it has a large price effect. That is, immediately our imports become more expensive, but the demand for our exports does not pick up suddenly. And this will cause the current account to worsen immediately and then pick up in the longer term. Refer to your notes for details on this very important point, the J-curve effect. That is, the improvement in the current account only happens after some time. 2 more points. One regarding the availability of excess supply in the local economy. When the price of your export falls, that is, your exports become more attractive abroad for foreign consumers, then foreign consumers' demand for your exports increases. But that demand can only be met, and those additional export revenues can only be earned if there is excess supply, excess production supply in the economy. If firms are already producing at full capacity, then they will not be able to meet the new orders that they get from foreign consumers, right? So there will be no advantage to devaluation. And finally, a very important point for indebted countries, for countries which have large amounts of foreign debt. Countries which have high amounts of foreign debt have suffer immensely when there is a devaluation, because the value of debt that they have to pay back increases in local currency terms. So, for example, if the debt of a country is, let's say, $100 billion, then if there is a devaluation, then the local currency value of that debt increases manyfold. And this has been the case for Pakistan as well, and for many other African countries. So those were some of the reasons which need to be addressed. Those qualifications need to be made before one can decide as to whether devaluation can help the current account position of a country or not. So, my friends, with that we come to the end of today's lecture. I thought that 2 lectures would be enough for me to cover the balance of payments issue at my very slow and gradual pace. But it was not possible. I had to go pretty fast in the end in order to complete this very important but slightly complex topic. Well, it's over. I really hope that you can go home and look at the problems, the concepts that we have covered today. In our next lecture, we'll talk about growth. and thereafter we'll talk about the interaction between these 4 problems that we have identified: unemployment, inflation, balance of payments problems, and growth or the lack of growth. So till next time, till our next lecture, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu alaikum.